Another issue I want you to think about in this unit on professional relationships and professional context is the matter of professional conscientious objection. Sometimes healthcare professionals, like other individuals, object for personal and often religiously grounded moral reasons to engaging behaviors that are common and accepted, legally recognized in the society. Specifically, we're looking at the moral considerations related to the reality of pharmacists who conscientiously object to filling prescriptions that may involve killing a blastocyst, a fertilized egg. Pro-life pharmacists regard this as abortion and regard abortion as murder, and seek to be able to refuse to write those or fill those prescriptions or provide those drugs. I've assigned you 3 readings in our Spiral textbook related to this issue. In this presentation, I'll be trying to make sense in a brief way of the basic issues without directly referring necessarily to those essays, although the issues raised there that I are in my summary here. So let's get started. First, let's take a look at some basic facts. First, drugs that prevent conception after the fact, morning after pills, that is to say after the fact of sexual intercourse, are available by prescription or behind the counter, though not typically on the shelf. That is to say, some kind of interaction with a pharmacist is required typically to get those pills. The pharmacist either has to fill the prescription or he or she has to reach under the counter, so to speak, and get the drug. Secondly, those drugs work, and there is some controversy about this, either by preventing fertilization or by preventing implantation of a fertilized egg, a blastocyst. Pro-life pharmacists are concerned that this possibility that these drugs work after conception by preventing implantation, that this means that they are killing a living human blastocyst. Some pharmacists then object to filling such prescriptions or dispensing the drugs from under the counter on personal, moral, or religious grounds. State and federal laws have typically tried to consider and give a limited space for conscientious objection, including protection of objectors from punishment. But pharmacists practice under a variety of such laws, some broader and some narrower in their attempt to protect conscientious objection. Now, these facts raise 2 related but distinguishable moral issues. The first one is the personal issue for the objecting pharmacist. What should he or she do? What are his or her obligations as an individual pharmacist? Maybe the more significant question is, what should the law or public policy be with respect to conscientiously objecting pharmacists? What are the moral obligations of the government or of we the people through our governments with respect to honoring the conscientious objection of pharmacists? Let's consider first the decision of the individual pharmacist. What are the moral considerations that suggest the conscientiously objecting pharmacist has a duty, or at least that it's permissible for him or her to refuse to fill the prescription or provide the drug? The most obvious consideration from the perspective of this pharmacist is non-maleficence, right? Those drugs may actually kill a fertilized egg. They may actually kill a living, individuated human being. That's, of course, why the pharmacist considers not writing the prescription, or not filling the prescription. Secondly, we might say that whether or not the pharmacist is right about that judgment, they have a profound obligation of fidelity to themselves, a profound obligation to preserve their own conscience, their own moral integrity. This may seem to you a rather odd moral consideration, but I would encourage you not to overlook its significance. Many would argue that if the very concept of morality means anything at all, if the very idea of ourselves as moral beings capable of thinking, choosing, deciding, and acting for ourselves and acting on the basis of moral conviction, if any of that has any meaning whatsoever, it implies or it suggests that our most fundamental duty, our most fundamental moral obligation, is to do what we, in our own lights, think is right. I mean, if we were ever to say to a person, well, of course your conscience tells you, your reasoning tells you that that act is wrong, but still you must do it, we would be telling them that morality does not matter. So even in a situation where a person has what we might regard as a minority viewpoint, but it is their firmly held point of view, they probably ought and have an obligation to themselves and maybe even to us to follow the dictates of their conscience. Indeed, some would say we should follow our conscience even when our conscience is wrong, because to fail to follow our conscience is to basically fail to take seriously the responsibility to be a moral person. Now, related to this, folks would say that this reality is acknowledged in many codes of ethics, and in particular, the pharmacist's code of ethics. The code affirms that a pharmacist has a duty to act with the conviction of conscience. That's our legitimate expectation of the pharmacist. So if the pharmacist, this particular pharmacist, is a pro-life pharmacist, don't we, in some sense, legitimately expect them, to refuse to fill such a prescription or to provide us such a drug? Now, as you might expect, of course, there are important moral considerations suggesting that even the conscientiously objecting pharmacist has an obligation, a duty, to provide the drugs. First, there is the duty of beneficence. As a pharmacist, they are committed and obligated to promote patient welfare, or to prevent, in this case, the patient harms related to pregnancy. Similarly, all healthcare professionals, including pharmacists, are obligated to respect patient autonomy by cooperating with and facilitating patient choice within the range of accepted and legal medical practices. The argument here would be the patient is seeking a drug that is legal, even if it is an abortifacient abortion, and the right to seek an abortion is legally protected, and therefore the pharmacist is obligated to respect patient autonomy in this area. And also related to this is the pharmacist's code of ethics and fidelity to the social expectations of the pharmacist. The professional role makes the obligation to promote patient welfare stronger or perfect. We don't think professionals typically have discretion in deciding whether or not to promote patient welfare. And similarly, of course, the code affirms the positive responsibility to respect patient autonomy. A final consideration that a pharmacist might raise when analyzing him or herself what they ought to do are considerations of self-interest, particularly when their own interests are connected to people who depend upon them, family members. Maybe the pharmacist might think that because of his own self-interest, in a situation where the law does not protect a conscientiously objecting pharmacist, that he or she should go on and write the prescription despite their moral uneasiness. So these are all reasons that a individual pharmacist might consider in trying to discern whether or not to write that prescription to which he or she objects. Well, all that I have just said is summarized here in this slide, where on the left I list the principles and the considerations that support a decision on the part of a morally uneasy pharmacist to refuse to fill the prescription or provide the drug. On the right are the moral considerations that same pharmacist might consider as he or she tries to discern what he should do in this situation of moral uneasiness on his or her part. Now, as I have suggested, the more interesting and significant question may be, what should law or policy say about this matter? Should law and policy, should we, the people, through our governments, protect objecting pharmacists? Should we provide space that protects their ability to conscientiously object to writing such, to filling such prescriptions or providing such drugs? Such laws would recognize their right to refuse to fill morning after pill prescriptions or provide behind-the-counter pills. It would prohibit the drugstores or drug companies that employ them from refusing to hire pharmacists who identify as pro-life and objecting to filling those prescriptions, providing those drugs. It would prohibit drugstores, drug companies from sanctioning, from firing, demoting those pharmacists. And it would protect those pharmacists from lawsuits. Now, such laws may well put limits around the pharmacist's right to object and the protections of that right. Limits related to the availability of alternatives for the patient. So such laws might say you may object, you may refuse to fill these prescriptions, but only if there's another pharmacist available to which you can refer the patient or another pharmacy nearby that can fill the prescription. The first and most significant consideration favoring a state duty to protect objecting pharmacists would appeal to autonomy. The obligation that each of us individually, and certainly all of us together through our governments, have to respect individual beliefs, values, and choices. Such respect, such rights are the cornerstone of a free society, right? Without such respect, or such respect is the very foundation of our freedom and our democracy. Respecting individual choice, respecting conscientious choice, is particularly important given the groundings of such objections, typically in religious belief. We tend to believe that a person's religious beliefs, their sense of responsibility to God, if that is a part of their religious beliefs, is among the most significant responsibilities and liberties that a person has. Of course, we do not all agree about these religious matters. Of course, we do not all agree about the moral conclusions we derive from our religious convictions, but providing space and honoring persons' rights to believe what they believe and to act upon that belief is absolutely the foundational for the sort of society that we have and the sort of society we believe to be just and fair to all people. A more specific appeal to justice here would be the claim that pharmacists might make that other healthcare professionals have been allowed to opt out of abortion. So typically, policies in hospitals, state laws respect the right of physicians to opt out of abortions and nurses to opt out of abortions. Why shouldn't pharmacists have the same protection, the same right? I would also point out that historically, even in times when we have had a military draft, we have allowed religious pacifists to opt out of military service. Doesn't justice require consistency? Doesn't justice require treating all people fairly? If we have created such space for other kinds of objection, shouldn't we create space for the pharmacists? And finally, the argument would be that it's possible to craft laws that still protect the welfare of patients by limiting this right to object such that the patient still has alternative ways of securing the prescription they seek. The law might require, as I've said, the objecting pharmacist to refer to another pharmacist. It might also limit their ability to object in situations where no other pharmacy or no other pharmacist is available to the patient because of distance or isolation. So all of these considerations suggest a duty on the part of government and a part of us through our government to respect the right of pharmacists to conscientiously object. Now, of course, not everyone agrees, and you might not be at all surprised to discover that there are important moral considerations that suggest the state ought not, or certainly is not obligated to protect objecting pharmacists. Most of the arguments that suggest this question whether it is really possible to craft a law that truly protects patient welfare, protects the ability of women to protect themselves from the harms of unwanted pregnancies. The idea here would be that given the emergency nature, given the urgency that's involved with these medications, delays in securing the drug will undermine women's welfare. And that's particularly true in contexts, in underserved areas where alternatives, other pharmacists, other pharmacies simply may not be available. Other people have also suggested that the situation of the pharmacist is quite different from doctors and nurses, and quite different from draftees into military service. Some would say, look, pharmacists aren't directly performing or participating in abortions like doctors and nurses may be when they simply fill a prescription or hand a patient a drug. It is still the patient who acts and who engages in the deadly activity and not the pharmacist himself or herself. And so the situation is not quite parallel. Also, with respect to the comparison to the draftee, the pharmacist is not forced to be a pharmacist. When we allow conscientious objections to draft laws, we are creating space for people who are otherwise being forced into military service. You're not forced to be a pharmacist, the argument would say. If you if you object to fulfilling the duties of a pharmacist, pursue another career. That option didn't exist for the draftee. So again, here on one slide is all that I have been saying on both sides of this dilemma, summarized in one place, with the consideration favoring protection of conscientiously objecting pharmacists on the left, consideration opposing the government's right or responsibility to protect such pharmacists on the right. Take a good look and make sure you understand what's written here. One final matter you should be aware of is the concern that some people have that laws that attempt to balance respect for patient welfare and autonomy with a recognition of a right of refusal on the part of conscientiously objecting pharmacists, that such laws will inevitably fail to satisfy the conscientiously objecting pharmacist. If you limit their right to object, by saying, well, you still must refer the patient to another pharmacist, or even actually fill the prescription if no such a pharmacist is available. If you limit their right in that way, most pharmacists will still find their conscience offended and still find themselves faced with that fundamentally difficult choice of either obeying the law or violating their conscience. So the idea would be it would be impossible to adequately protect pharmacists from the violation of their conscience and the threat of sanctions by the companies for which they work or lawsuits from the patients that they refuse to serve.